So a very big welcome to yourselves and to Ian, our talker tonight. He has already done a couple of presentations for the Nature Group, which have proved very popular. We can tell who's looking at the recordings, and there is a big audience still looking at his YouTube recordings. He's also done one for the distinctions department on how to prepare your files if you're doing a submission, which is also available. If you haven't found the link, ask us and we can share that with you as well. So I'm not going to go on any further. We apologise that Duncan Locke, our secretary who usually runs the meetings for us, he's not available today. So I'm hoping it all goes well. And over to Ian, I think.
Thank you, Anne. Let me show. I'm going to share the screen now. All right, and there's no dogs. You're safe. There's no dogs. Right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm going to start off with essentially what amounts to a preemptive apology. As discussed earlier, we had there's COVID around, quite a lot of COVID around at the moment, and I had it almost exactly 3 weeks ago. In fact, exactly 3 weeks ago. It's left me with a voice that is struggling, the occasional coughing fit, and a throat that feels freshly sandpapered. So I do apologise if I'm a bit croaky. If you can't hear me, then please send Anna something in the chat, and she'll poke me and tell me to speak louder or shut up or something. That's what she normally does. Okie doke. Right, let's start. So we're talking about selective editing today. So what do we actually mean by selective editing? Now let's start back to basics. Essentially, selective editing just means applying an edit to one part of the picture, but not to another part, or a different edit to another part of the picture. All right, that's really all we mean by selective editing. So why would you want to do it? All right, well, there are two primary reasons, and we'll look at each of those independently. And this is one of them. This is the classic one, and that is that the cameras themselves are simply not as good as the human eye when it comes to capturing a scene. And there are two big issues there. One is exposure and the other is white balance. We'll come on to the white balance one a little bit later. But the classic exposure problem is that you end up with a scene like this. This is in Iceland. It's on the Snæfell Peninsula, if you've been there, and there was some severe weather coming our way. There was no way I was going to be able to put up a tripod or put on a graduated neutral density filter or anything like that. I had to do the best I could, try and get an exposure that would work for the scenes. I wasn't going to lose detail. And what you end up with is something which is basically bleh. All right, because in fact, if you look at the histogram, it's fairly obvious what the problem is. Yeah, we've got a huge number of pixels over here, which are the highlights, the sky essentially, and another load of pixels over here, which are the shadows, which is the foreground. All right, no exposure would have got them right for both. I could have got the sky, so the sky was looking good, and the black background would have gone into pure shadow. If I'd exposed for the foreground, I would have got a blown out sky. There's no way to do that. So you say, well, that's okay, no problem. We can go in there and we can do edits. So we can pull, maybe we can pull the highlights down, or we can push the shadows up, and that will cure the problem. So you go in there and let's say we pull the highlights down. That's fine. Let's push the shadows up, and you end up with a result which is frankly horrible. Yes, you can do that, but what you end up with is something that looks terribly HDR-ish. Essentially, you're creating an HDR out of an individual image. So you are reducing the contrast. Of course, that's the other way of doing it, is just to reduce the contrast. But it just looks horrid. Right. The best way of doing this is to say, right, this is a picture of two halves. Let's tackle it in two halves. Let's do the sky, get the sky right, and then we will do the foreground, and we'll get the foreground right. So this is one of the reasons why you want to do it. So let me just reset that. So let's start off. Let's get ourselves a reasonable white balance. I'm just going to go in there, something a bit like that. That's probably a little bit warm. 5500 is probably about right, maybe 5. Let's go to white balance. So I'm going to be, okay, I should say, no, I'm going to be working in the raw converter Lightroom most of the time. I'm going to be flipping over into Photoshop and also into 2 different sets of plugins, Nick and Topaz. But nowadays, the raw converters are so incredibly powerful and there's so much there. Actually, most of the work you want to do can be done in the raw converter. So that's where I'm going to be. Anybody who works in Adobe Camera Raw, as opposed to Lightroom, it's all still there, just a slightly different user interface. All right, so what we do, we need, all right, 2 stages in doing selective edit. One is to define where you want the edits applied, and the other is to actually apply the edit. All right, now in Lightroom, we've got these things here called masking. There's a button up here called masking. Click on that one, and now I'm going to apply a linear gradient, essentially what I would have done over the camera. Linear gradients. So now it's up to me to decide where on earth I'm going to put this gradient. So I'm just going to pull the gradient down. Now, this is what, if you played the gradients before, essentially there is the area before the start of the gradient, which is fully applied. There's the area after the end of the gradient where it's not applied at all, and then there is a gradient, a gradual fade between the two. Now, one of the big issues with gradients is trying to get them straight. Right, it's almost impossible to try and do it manually. You can do it if you want to do that manually. If you put your cursor over the middle line. The trick is to go as far away from the center as possible, and you can then set that, or you can just hold the shift key down. And in principle, if I just lose that gradient, delete the gradient. If I pull it on again, and where are we? Linear gradient. If I hold the shift key down, now it will force it to be vertical, horizontal, or one of those things. So I'm just going to pull a gradient a bit like that. All right. The beauty is you can go into these things and edit it a little bit later. I'm going to pull, just now do some work on the sky. So I've selected the sky. I'm going to pull the exposure down a little bit. Maybe push the contrast up a little bit. You know, try and create that drama, that atmosphere that I wanted, that I was seeing when I was there. Maybe pull the highlights down, because we know the sky is going to contain lots of highlights. As you pull the highlights down, we've lost some of the whites. So I'm going to pull the whites up a little bit as well. Something a bit like that. I'm also going to apply a little bit of clarity that will just bring out that mid-tone detail in the sky. But this is something I'm going to come back to again and again. Sharpening, you don't necessarily want to sharpen the sky, so I can pull the sharpness down a little bit. So I don't want to apply sharpening to the sky. All right, so these are a load of adjustments that are being applied only to the sky. All right, so now we want to do the foreground, and the foreground is kind of the opposite. All right, we'll create a new mask, this time another linear gradient. All right, there are umpteen different ways of doing this, but I'm just going to choose a linear gradient. This time I'm going to draw from the ground up, as it were. All right, and what do we want to do? Well, we want to basically make the foreground a bit brighter. Now, this is one of the huge advantages of doing things selectively, is that you can select different white and black points in different parts of your picture. And this is really useful, because having done that, what's happened is it's made the foreground too bright. All right, so we brighten the shadows. In fact, we're probably better to brighten the shadows rather than that one. We can maybe pull the blacks down a little bit to make sure we don't lose any of that, because that was what was making things look HDR-ish, is having no true blacks. All right, so we've done that one. We can apply some clarity, maybe. We can apply a little bit of texture. Maybe we can pull the exposure down just a little bit. Maybe even apply a little bit of extra saturation to bring out the detail in that moss that was there. And of course, we can apply a little bit of extra sharpening, because we want the rocks and what have you to be sharp, but we don't necessarily want the sky to be sharp. Now, obviously, I'm doing this extremely roughly. I'm not worrying too much about whether or not I'm getting a good selection along those edges. But if I just close that down, and if we go back between the two, so that was the original. Okay, you're also seeing some lens corrections being applied. We are actually, the important thing is that we've split the image into two, and we're saying, right, we're going to tackle the highlights separately to the shadows, or the sky separately to the foreground. All right, and this is essentially where we're going to keep coming back to time and time again. There will be something in the picture which we will do one thing to, and then there'll be usually the rest of the picture which we do something different to. All right, often caused by a problem to do with the way that the image is captured. Right, but there's a second reason why we might want to do some selective editing. So that is one obvious one, which is where we've got a problem with the camera. And this is to do with essentially guiding the viewer. All right, so we've got a horribly overexposed picture here of a rather splendid eagle owl. All right, it's all bright. Okay, so we can go in and we can fix that. We can fix that by working globally. Fair enough. So I'm going to go in and we can maybe pull down. We can pull down the. Well, let's get the white balance right first of all. It's normally round about, I don't know, let's try 52, 55, something like that. That's too yellow. 5,000, maybe something like that. Something a bit like that. Let's pull the exposure down because, as I say, it was probably about 1/2 to 3/4 of a stop overexposed. So that's starting to look a little bit better on the exposure front. All right, now keep an eye on your histogram. I find that for the majority of pictures anyway, you do actually want a full range of black to white, and this is where the whites and the black sliders really are superb. So I'm going to hold my Alt key down. Let's pull the blacks down. Make sure we've got a full black somewhere. Make sure we got close to a full white somewhere. We're starting to see a little bit of clipping there, so I'm going to pull the whites back. Something a bit like that. Okay, maybe we can play with the contrast slightly. Maybe not. Okay, so we've done a basic raw conversion, but it's looking a bit flat. That the tonality is kind of very similar across the entire picture, and so the color is actually relatively similar too. So the eye is kind of moving around. You're not looking at a particular part of the picture. But it's actually very straightforward to essentially direct the viewer to look at one part of a picture rather than another. And what you just need to understand a little bit of psychology of how we look at pictures. And we as humans, we tend to be attracted to things that are bright, that are sharp, that are high contrast, and that are colorful. All right. So if you can make the thing that you want the viewer to look at fit into one or more of those categories, and the bits that you don't want the viewer to look at fitting into the opposite of those categories, you're onto a winner, because then the eye is going to unwittingly go and look at those bits. All right, so in this case, let's have a look. What do you want to do? Well, we can make the face of the owl brighter. All right, and this is probably I think one of my favorite selective adjustment actually is this thing called the radial gradient, which essentially just means you're drawing an ellipse, a circle or a stretched circle. All right, so I'm going to start by drawing that in here. All right, so at the moment the red is showing the bit that is selected, that is the primary area. Now in this case I'm going to, the owl, the face is slightly on the tilt. And if you hover your cursor just outside that, you can adjust the angle of the ellipse. You can adjust the central part of the ellipse, which essentially it's a classic gradient. It's fully applied in the middle. It's not applied at all outside, and then there is a gradient in between. So I'm going to do something a bit like that. And what we can do now is we can pull the exposure up a little bit of that face, right? We can be careful with the highlights. I'm just going to pull the highlights a little bit back. We don't want to clip those highlights. We can apply a little bit, maybe a bit of extra clarity, maybe a bit of extra contrast, something like that. And we have made a face. We can apply a little bit of sharpness as well, because that's what we want the viewer to look at. So we've applied some of those things that we as humans like to look at, we've applied them to the face. But we can make it better still by essentially doing the opposite to the background. All right, and this is something that you'll find yourself doing time and time again, is this mask here, the three dots. If you click on the three dots, one of the options is to duplicate and invert. All right, which essentially is saying, just make me a mask which is the opposite of this one. All right, so now I've got this one, and this is now essentially the background. So with the background, what I can do is maybe take the exposure down a little bit, maybe take the contrast down a bit, maybe take the saturation down a little bit, right, and maybe take the sharpness down a little bit. Right, there are plenty of other things you could do as well. You know, you start talking about sharpening and noise reduction and all that kind of stuff. But what we've done essentially, let's go back to the where we have mask one inverted. There's the mask. This is part of the problem, is you get lost as to what it is. So I'm just going to double click on that mask, and we'll say that that is the face, or if I could spell face, and I'll double click on that one there, and we'll call that one background. Okay, so the face, on the face here, maybe we can apply a little bit of extra saturation, something like that. You know, you could go in, obviously you're not limited to this. We could go in and we could apply another adjustment on the eyes, another adjustment on the beak, and so on. But the important thing is, if I now go back to close and I compare that against the original, you know, it's subtle. It's very, very subtle. In fact, I can turn, if I just turn the turn these masks on or off. What we've done is we've made the face slightly brighter and slightly more contrasty and slightly sharper than it was before, and we've made the background slightly duller, slightly less saturated, slightly less contrasty than it was before, and as a result our eyes go straight to the middle of the picture. That's what we're trying to do. All right, so you'll find this time and time again, that you're essentially working in opposites. You're applying one effect to what is the primary subject, or the thing that you want the viewer to look at, and the opposite effect, or something which essentially to take the viewer's eye away from the bits you don't want them to look at. So those are the two main reasons. So essentially, one is corrective, where you are correcting things like exposure or white balance or what have you. You can't do that globally. And the other is essentially interpretive, where you are tweaking the picture slightly to make it more obvious to the viewer which bits they should be looking at. That's really what we're doing. Okay, so let's move on. So let's look at another classic problem, which is a corrective problem. And this is an image that I took absolutely ages ago, and why I didn't delete it, I have no idea. Maybe it was because at the time I couldn't really process it properly in the raw converters that were available. All right. As you can see here, these are some water buck. And it was actually the middle of the afternoon, or something like that, 2-3 o'clock in the afternoon or something. African sun. It was extremely hot. It was very, very sunny, and they were just shading. They were inside, underneath the tree canopy, and they were shading. And as you can see here, though obviously this is the white balance as the picture was taken, it's a little bit cold anyway. But we've got a problem, because we've got part of the background here was in sunshine, and so is going to have the white balance of the sunshine, and part of the image is in shade, and therefore is going to have the white balance of the shade. All right, so it's a bit like the first picture. If I go in there and I try and correct this with global white balance, let's crop it, because we've got other rubbish that we want to get rid of. So let's just crop in a little bit. We'll get rid of that area up the top, something a bit like that. I'm not pushing these as being great pictures, they're not, but they're here to illustrate what I'm trying to say. So there's our image. Let us try and correct the white balance. All right, so if we go to obviously it's very blue. If I try and correct it so that it's right for the water buck, which is closer to something like that, All right. It's a little bit underexposed as well. That's closer to what the fur of a waterbuck looks like. The background has gone horrendously kind of orangey yellow, right? Because this is the problem. We've got a background which is in sunshine and therefore needs sunshine white balance, and we've got a foreground which is in shade and therefore needs shade white balance. Therefore, we need to be able to work selectively and correct the white balance selectively. So I'm going to leave the exposure as it is, approximately like that one. All right, let's first of all, let's get the white balance right for the background. So something a bit like that. This is giving us reasonably accurate looking colors. Obviously, I have no idea how this is coming across on Zoom, but relatively accurate colors for the background. Okay, so now let's tackle the waterbuck. All right, and to do that, again, we're essentially repeating the same as we did before. We are going to make a selection. We're going to select an area where we want to work, and then we're going to decide what we're going to do in that area. All right. And in this case, we're going to start off by playing around with selective white balance, and then a little bit of exposure as well. So here, obviously, we can't easily use a gradient, either a linear or a radial. I'm just going to use a brush, and they all work in exactly the same way. Okay, now the brush. What we're going to be doing is painting over the image, where we want the effect to be applied. So these are things that you need to be aware of. I'm just going to very, very quickly just show you things to be aware of with the brush. Okay, you've got these controls: size, feather, flow, and density, with a little checkbox called auto mask. So I'll show you what each of those does. Size, I hope, is relatively self-evident. All right, it alters the size of the brush. So if I draw a line over like that one, all right, that is drawing a hard-edged line. However, if you can see, because I've got auto mask on, can you see it's finding edges where I drew? If I don't want that, if I just want to paint, then you turn auto mask off. So that's the difference between auto mask and non-auto mask. It's actually finding edges. So it's useful when you're going around something and you don't want to worry about spilling over the edge. But if you're trying to fill large areas, auto mask can be a bit of a pain, because actually it will stop you working properly. And indeed, I'm going to turn auto mask off for this particular exercise. Just go back again. All right, so that was where are we? So we've shown you size and auto mask. Feathering, show you that's without feathering. With feathering, it's just like it is in Photoshop. Feathering gives you a soft brush, no feather gives you a hard brush. All right, so in this case, we're going to be working with a soft brush, because we don't want a very, very harsh edge around where we're going to be painting. All right, and the other thing now is flow and density. People get confused between the difference between flow and density. Density is the maximum, essentially, opacity of the brush. So if I set that to I don't know, 50%, and I paint over, and I then paint over again, it's not going to build up. The maximum is set to, in this case, 55%. It's not going to get any more than that. Right, so let's just go back, just showing you the difference between flow and density. So if I go back again, and we have, so I pushed the density up to 100, but I put the flow right down, maybe something like 10%, something like that. Now what I can do is, as I paint over more and more, I don't know if you can see, it is gradually building up. All right, so it's more like using a spray can. It's more like, as you go painting over with dilute paint, you're gradually building an effect up. Okay, so let's just hide that. Oh, it's too many. Let me just delete all masks. All right, so those are the controls. So with that in mind, what we're going to do now is we're going to paint with a brush, and I'm going to have the density set up to 100, but I want the flow a little bit lower, because I want to be able to build the flow up. So I'm going to paint over the area where I know I want to change the white balance. So I'm just going to paint over The reason, I hope will be obvious in a second, why I'm not using auto mask here is that because we've got things like the eyes and other bits of fur and these grass stems and things like that, Lightroom's going to find those as edges and it's going to stop me painting at those edges. And I do want to be able to paint at those edges. So you can change the size of the brush exactly the same as Photoshop. The square bracket key will reduce or increase the size of your brush. So I'm just going to go in there. I want a slightly lower effect applied to the one behind. This is where the flow really comes in. We can have a much stronger effect on the one on the front and a much lower effect on the one on the back. Okay, all I've done so far is paint my waterbuck red. Right, you can change the color, by the way. In this case, red is absolutely fine. So having made the selection, the next thing to do is to decide what we're going to, what adjustment we're going to make. So we are just going to, in this case, we're going to pull the yellows up. We're actually going to warm it up until we get something a little bit more natural for the color of the fur of the waterbuck. Now, you can do this in either order. You can either make the adjustment and then go in and do the painting, or you can do the painting and then go and make the adjustment, or of course, vice versa. It's entirely up to you. All right. I've actually started off with making the painting just because I wanted then to see what the effect was. All right. All right, so there we are. So we've got our, I'm going to put a little bit more there because it's still looking a tiny little bit blue, and that's looking a little bit blue over there. All right, we can actually brighten those areas up slightly because we want them to stand out from the background. Maybe we can pull the blacks back just to make sure we don't lose blacks. Maybe add a little bit of clarity, maybe add a little bit of texture or something like that. Okay, so what that's done now is that has essentially done the corrective part. All right, that has corrected the white balance of the two animals. So we've now got what looks like a natural color for the waterbuck and a natural color for the background. All right, which is the important thing. But of course, we can then apply the second phase of what we want to do, which is to essentially, we want this waterbuck in the foreground to pop out of what's happening behind. All right, so I'm going to now create a new mask, which is going to, so creating a new mask allows me to do a different adjustment. So in this case, I'll make another brush, right? And this time I just want to make it a little bit brighter, and I want to bring out some more sharpness in this area, this waterbuck at the front. Again, I'm using a low flow. And the reason for using a low flow is that you can gradually just build the effect up. So I'm just going to, I don't know if you can see this effect. It should be so subtle that you can't tell that it's been done. But I'm just going in there and brightening up that one. Now, of course, you could go in and you could darken down the one behind as well. We can apply here, again, a little bit of extra clarity, a little bit of extra sharpness maybe, because we want the eye to really concentrate on this one in front, because that's the one that you want to be sharp and you want everything behind to be relatively softer. And now we've now got a kind of three-dimensionality there. Okay, so essentially what we've done here is to bring the two things together. We've done some corrective adjustment because the white balance was wrong or different in one part of the picture compared to another part of the picture. But we've also done a little bit of tweaking here to make the eye look at this central part, the part that we want the viewer to concentrate on. You could, of course, add a vignette. This is another thing, which is another kind of selective adjustment. So I will do that now. Effects here, post-crop vignetting down here. I will maybe add, I'm just take that down a little bit and just darken down the edges. Something we always used to do in the darkroom. Very, very common technique to essentially to stop one's eye wandering out of the edge of the picture. So I'm just going to do that when you can alter the roundness of it. All I've done is to darken the edge. And a vignette is a very, very common thing to apply to a picture to essentially just to hold the eye in. You'll hear judges talking about holding the eye in. It's essentially what you're doing. You're making it so that it's more difficult for the eye. The eye sees a boundary at the outside. Okay, so there we've applied the two together. We've done some corrective and we've done some other adjustments to try and make the subject stand out. Okie doke, let's get a little bit more advanced. Okay, so far we've used separate masks. All right, but one of the things that we can do, one of the things this system allows you to do is to combine masks. All right, and that can be very, very useful. You have to keep your head screwed on because it can be a bit scary, but it's relatively, it is a very, very powerful thing to do. So let's start off staying with the African theme. Yeah, this shows that we're all capable of taking a photo which is cockeyed. This was taken out of a vehicle. Obviously, we weren't allowed to get out and do it. So obviously, there are corrections need to be done to this when we need to make sure that we can get the thing straight and to do the basic adjustment. But the issue you have with this is, of course, there's actually very little difference in tonality and color between the main subject, which in this case is the elephant, and the background. They kind of merge into one another. Now, obviously, when we were there, when we saw this with our own two eyes, as it were, we see it with stereoscopic vision. And the elephant would have stood out from the background because of a three-dimensionality. It would have appeared to stand away from its background. As soon as you take a photograph, of course, you're working in 2 dimensions. Okay, and this is a problem. So we've somehow got to recreate that third dimension. We've got to make the subject pop away from its background. Okay, so let's do some basic adjustments here. So let's go. First of all, let's get it straight. Okay, so I'm going to just crop it in and maybe get that so that the elephant is standing upright, which is a good thing to do. Let's just crop it in a little bit. Something a bit like that. So that's what I want. I want the eye roughly in the middle, something a bit like that. All right, so that's got the crop right. So we've now got an upright elephant, which is clearly a good thing. So let's get the it's a bit cold at the moment. Let's get the white balance right. Let's push it up a little bit. I roughly find, I don't know about you, I tend to find that some white balances keep coming back time and time again, maybe 5, something like that. So that gives us a reasonable white balance. Maybe that's a little bit much, actually, a little bit much magenta. There we are. It's a little bit too much magenta. All right, let's get the exposure right. So far, all we're doing is basic raw conversion. So these are all global adjustments. So let's do the basic global adjustment. So let's get let's push that up a little bit like that. And then maybe, I don't want to, the elephant skin isn't too bright, so I don't want to go too much further than that one. But I do want to make sure we've got a true white point. So I'm holding the Alt key down, I'm pulling my whites up until they clip and then pulling them back. Make sure we've got a good black point somewhere. That's always a good thing to do. Obviously there are exceptions, but almost always you do want a good black point in your picture. All right, so that's already looking significantly better. Now the problem is we want to kind of we want to make that elephant pop, so we can make it brighter, weaker, or in fact brighter or darker than the background. We can give it more sharpness, more clarity, more color. All those things will make it pop out. All right, so let's try now working on the elephant. And this is where, luckily, you'll be pleased to hear, we don't normally have to go around and paint around the elephant. There's this wonderful thing called Select Subject. All right, so this is where the artificial intelligence within these programs really comes to the fore. So here, it's made a pretty damn good job of selecting the elephant. Okay, it's created a mask, and this is now a select subject. Right, this is where modifying the mask comes in, because essentially these leaves are part of the subject. All right, we want them to, because they're in the same focal plane as the elephant, we want them to pop out as well. And they have not been selected as part of the select subject. So we want to add them to the selection. And that's where these 2 buttons here called add and subtract. So I'm going to add with a brush. Okay, so I'm going to go in This is our old friend, so we're just going to paint over here. Now here I probably do want to enable the auto mask. I'm going to put the flow up, and I'm going to use a smaller brush. I'm just going to go in there and kind of paint over these leaves. All right. So the auto mask is helping me here. If I go over the edge, you see the crosshairs in the middle. Providing I keep the crosshairs within the leaves, it ought to make a reasonably good job. It doesn't have to be that accurate. It really doesn't have to be that accurate. So let's just go through. I'm just going through painting those very, very roughly. All right. I just want them to have the same kind of effect as the elephant. That's all. All right. So I've done some very, very rough painting here. So we've used this to add to a selection. All right. Let's go back again. All right. So what do we want to do to the elephant? Well, elephants are kind of crinkly and they've got lots and lots of texture. So what we can do now is we can make the elephant slightly brighter than it was. We can add a bit of contrast to the elephants. We can add some texture to the elephants. Maybe add a bit of clarity. Maybe lift the shadows a little bit. There are various things you can do to make sure. So the elephant is now, I hope you'll agree, starting to pop out from its background. Okay, it's starting to look a little bit more like it's a three-dimensional picture, but it's still very, very similar tonality to the background. Okay, so let's do some work on the background. Remember what we did last time? We actually created an inverse of this mask, so we'll do that again. This mask here, 3 dots, duplicate and invert. So we're now creating a mask for everything which isn't elephant. So in other words, background. All right, so we're going to do some background. Now, this is for me is a bug. I guess Adobe would call it a feature. You cannot change the name of a mask until you have painted something on it. That's really irritating. So, actually, it's a lie. Okay, this has already got something there by dint of having been created, so I can change this one. So I'm going to call it background. But normally, if you create a new mask, you can't actually change its name until you've painted something on it, which is a bit irritating. Let's change the name of that to elephant. This is just the same as changing layer names in Photoshop. So what can we do here? Well, we can. This is where, remember what I said about the fact that the eye goes away from things which are lower contrast, lower saturation, lower sharpness, whatever. So I'm just going to try taking, if I take the contrast down a little bit at the background, I'm going to take the saturation down of the background a little bit. I'm going to take the clarity down of the background. Okay. And I'm going to take, now there's various ways of doing this. Dehaze is particularly good at this one because that will both lighten the background as well as removing some detail. Right, so I'm essentially what I'm trying to do is to make the background kind of fade. I can turn the sharpness down on the background. Right, turn the clarity down on the background. Now, this, if you look at this, you're trying your mind to split it up into the upper part and the lower part of the picture. It's actually making the elephant stand out really quite nicely from its background, but it's made the foreground look a little bit rubbish, actually, because the elephant now looks more like a cutout. Bear in mind that if you're going to do some selective editing, you've got to make it look natural. And what we've done is we've essentially reduced detail, saturation, all that kind of stuff from the same focal plane that the elephant was standing in. And therefore, it looks like a cutout. And we don't want it to look like a cutout. So this is where the ability to adjust a mask really helps. Remember last time we added to a mask, this time we're going to subtract from it. So essentially you've got to think about, if you remember from school days, perhaps, I don't know whether you'd studied these at school days, good old-fashioned Venn diagrams, overlapping areas, non-overlapping areas, intersecting areas, things like that. What we want to be able to do is to remove this adjustment that we've just made from the lower part of the picture, but not remove it from the upper part. And we know how to do that because if we subtract a linear gradient, Okay, so I'm going to draw a linear gradient now, hold the shift key down and then draw that linear gradient, possibly even put it at a slight angle, something a bit like that. What we've got now is we've removed those effects, the contrast effects, the sharpening effects, all that kind of things from the foreground, but we are still applying them to the area behind the elephant. Okay, so if I go back and close those. So let me just try and do a before and after comparison. So that's where are we? So yeah, and of course you can go back in and you can edit these further if we decide we want to add more clarity, we want to bring the exposure up or more contrast or something like that to the elephant. We can go in and do that. We've got the adjustment. But I hope what you're seeing now is that we're essentially treating the subject and the background as separate entities, and we're applying the adjustments independently to them, making the subject stand out as a result. But you've got to bear in mind that you want to get a result which is actually believable, and that might mean removing some of those effects in certain parts of the picture. So we've removed all those kind of fuzzying effects, if you like, from the foreground. So that's adding and subtracting from mask to end up with something which is hopefully a bit more three-dimensional, a bit more believable than, or a bit more easy to read than the original image. Obviously, you can add a vignette. So this is one of those things. I'm not going to do that to every single image. Okie doke. All right, let's look at another one. Extreme shadow. This is another one of those. This is another one of those images that's. I have no idea why I kept this file, but it does actually. There's a moral here, and the moral is this is a picture going back to 2009, I think, something like that, shot on a camera which was not known for its dynamic range, or not known for it. It's obviously these sensors have got an awful lot better sense. But I was still in film mentality days, so I didn't throw anything away. But at the time, we were just not capable, the tools were not capable of doing any doing this kind of work. If you corrected the white balance here, or you corrected the exposure on the elephant came out bright blue. It's just like the problem we had with the water butt earlier on. All right. The tools are now there, you'll be pleased to hear. So let's just go in and show that it is astonishingly possible to recover an image like this. All right, so let's get the classic thing. Let's get the white balance right. It was about 5,000, something like that. Let's get the background about right. So let's just so let's work on that one. Let's push the whites up. Let's push the blacks down. I'll pull the blacks down. There we are. So we end up now. We've got a background which is looking moderately okay. That's roughly what the scrub where this elephant was actually looks like. But the elephant clearly is way too dark. All right, you can't tell yet. It's also way too blue. So same thing again. Let's go in here, select subject. Now bear in mind the select subject, you might strike lucky. It might be that it's okay. It might do a really good job. Now, in this case, it's done a pretty damn good job, but there are some areas that it's missed out. The poor elephant's tail was not deemed to be part of the subject. And we've also got issues around we've got some bits that shouldn't be here in the middle between the trunk and the front leg. We've got some bits at the top that need to be there. So this is where you go in and you do a little bit of adjustment. So we're going to add to the mask with a brush. All right, so we're going to go in and Command plus will allow you to zoom in. So I'm going to do a little bit of tail painting. Let's have the flow right up with auto mask on. First, I want to paint this tail. Right, and so long as I keep the crosshair of that brush within the area that I'm painting, I should be okay. And I can turn the flow down if I just want to fade this down to here. All right, so that's fixed the tail. Let's go up. Now along the back here, I suspect I'm going to have to turn auto mask off. All right, so I'm just going to make a smaller brush. I'm just going to go in and paint over those areas that have been missed. It's probably not going to be critical, but I'm going to be thorough and just go through. Actually, let's get the flow up. There we are. All right. If you go, I will deliberately go over here. If you go over, you can always put the mask back on, hold the Alt key down, that will turn it into a brush that removes, and then go round and just remove that bit where I went over the top. Okay, so I'm just going through. I'm not going to go around everything because otherwise we'll be here until doomsday, but you get the basic idea. All right, like with all selections, the more time you can spend on them, the better they will be. Okie doke. So we've now got, if I now zoom back out again, we've now got our elephant. We now want to just remove a little bit from the central bit. So I'm going to go to subtract. Now these are truly layers, all right? The order of the adds and subtract does matter, all right? Because each one will be altering what has gone before. So just bear that one in mind. Again, I'm going to go for the brush, auto mask. Let's zoom in. And I'm just going to remove from that area there. Okay, so that's all that needs to be done. So, you know, just bear in mind, if you think you're painting an add and nothing's appearing, it could be because there's a subtract above it in the layer stack, which is removing it. All right, so just bear in mind, this is a layer stack. All right, or a mask stack, if you like. Okay, so what do we need to do with the elephant? Well, clearly we need to try and get its color and exposure right. So let's just try lifting the exposure. Right, this is, and let's just pull the shadows up a little bit. Now, this is what I mean about blue elephants. All right, you've heard of pink elephants and white elephants. Well, this is a blue elephant. So clearly, problem we've got here is if we try and get the tonality about right on this elephant, then obviously the color is wrong, but also it's looking rather bleached. All right, we've lost all true blacks in the elephant, and this is what I said earlier on. It's incredibly useful to have separate white and black points for different parts of the picture. So in this case, first of all, let's get the color right. I'm going to apply some yellow to this elephant because it was rolling in fairly red mud. So I'm going to correct the color. I'm going to pull the blacks down to make sure we get a full black point. Now, this is one of those cases where the holding the Alt key down doesn't actually work. Don't know why, but for some reason Adobe decided they weren't going to do that. So if you want to be clear about whether or not you're clipping in the area where you're working, you've got to keep an eye on the shadow clipping, in this case shadow clipping. So if I were to pull that right down, you can see that the shadow clipping has been enabled. Let's come on. All right, so I'm just going to pull that up a little bit, maybe pull the blacks down. What you'll find is that if you push the exposure up, you'll then probably want to pull the blacks down. I'm going to get, again, it's an elephant. It has lots of texture. There's probably a little bit too much magenta in there. Let's take the magenta down. That's looking more like it. Let's add a little bit of clarity, a little bit of texture, pull those shadows up. Okay, I'm not going to spend a lot of time doing this, but you've got the same basic principle as before, right? And I could go in and play around with the background here. But the important thing is, if I turn that mask on and off, we've gone from an almost black elephant to one which is, you know, acceptable. All right, and there may be times when these animals do go out in the midday, and you do want to be able to try and get them. That would not have been possible with earlier versions of the software. So it's if you've got an image which is promising, but you can't yet work on it because you don't have the tools for it, or you don't have the skill for it, don't throw it away. Keep it, because your skills will improve, and the tools will improve as well. right? So I could go in and do more with this one. I'm not going to. I'm going to carry on looking at something else. Right, let's carry on with this is another kind of image where we want to do some selective processing. All right, so we've got an image where we've got it's one of those wonderful hornet mimic hoverflies. Wonderful things, great color. It's underexposed, clearly it's underexposed, but we also, what's the subject here? The subject here is the fly. All right, that's what we want the viewer to look at. We've then got the flower. The flower is the secondary subject. That is part of where we want to, obviously it's part of the story, but it's not the main part of the story. And then we have the leaves behind, and the leaves are kind of incidental. They're just setting the scene. All right. So you can go in, let's go in and do a very rough raw conversion on this one. Let's do a crop, because we don't want too much in the way of leaves. Okay, something a bit like that. Okay, so that gets us that one. We'll something like that's a bit blue at the moment, and I think that was, so let's get a color that's looking about right. So I'm going to just, right. So that's a reasonable start. Let's just pull the whites up. All right, and pull the highlights down a little bit. Right. So that's got the flower about right, but the fly itself, the butterfly itself, is still a bit dark, it's a little bit dull. And as you can see, what's happened to the background, this is something that frequently happens when you play around. The greens tend to go a little bit vibrant, and the greens are now looking a bit in your face. So we want to get rid of that. So let's do the greens first of all. We know we can do that. We can use because this is a circular flower, we can use a radial gradient. So let's go to radial gradients. Let's go in there. Now, one of the things you have to understand about any kind of selection is that sometimes you're thinking positively and sometimes you're thinking negatively. Right? So we want to select everything apart from the flower effectively. All right, but we're going to we've drawn the radial gradient, which is the flower, and then there's a little checkbox up here called invert. So I'm going to invert that. I'm then I can reposition it. I can alter that bit in the middle. So we'll do that one. Just make it, we could always rotate it around if we wanted to. All right, so now our favorite trick, we're going to take the exposure down a little bit from what's behind. We'll take the contrast down. We'll take the highlights down. We'll take the saturation down. And we can take the sharpness down as well. There are all sorts of tricks you can do to try and dampen down the background. So this is effectively, if I just turn that on and off, that mask on and off. All right, it's just dulls down the background. So the greens are no longer in your face. You can actually play around with the hue. I'm not going to do that at the moment, but you can actually just dull them down just by drawing that. Now you want to do the hoverfly. Now this is one of those cases where select subject doesn't work. I'm not going to waste time doing it. Select subject actually selects the entire flower. We don't want that one. So in this case, you're reduced to going in and drawing it. All right, so I'm going to create a new mask with a brush. We'll use the high flow, high density, got auto mask on. I'm just going to zoom in, and I'm just going to paint over the hoverfly. And I'm going to do it very quickly because I don't want to spend the entire afternoon drawing masks. Just be careful, as I said, I don't know if you can see, as I'm painting, the auto mask is finding edges. So you may find that you want to turn the auto mask off and draw the inside. It's a bit like colouring in, really, to do the inside of the selection, and then you turn the auto mask on to do the the edges, the bit where you need to be very careful when, essentially when you're doing your colouring in. But just be very careful because there are bits here that it might miss. You can see that. So I'm just going to go in, draw that. Just very quickly do that. Oops. There we are. That will do. It's good enough. It's close enough for government work. That will do. Okay. All right. So having made that selection, I could go in and do the legs, which I'm not going to do at the moment. But obviously, I could now play around and actually make that hoverfly stand out a little bit more. Just going to zoom back because I want to be able to see the entire picture. So I could push its exposure up. I could push the contrast up a little bit, maybe push the shadows up, push the highlights back down, add some extra sharpness to it, maybe add a little bit of extra clarity to it, and so on. All right. And now maybe I've done that as a little bit OTT, but I think you'll agree that if I turn those masks on and off, the hoverfly is now standing out as the subject of that picture. Yes, I can see that I have now done it slightly too much. I'm just going to turn, let's just take the contrast back down. You want it to be believable. Okay, so that's another one doing that kind of work in the raw converter. But I'm just going to introduce another concept now, which is if you're like me and you've used the NIC filters, there are some jobs like that that are actually much easier in the NIC filters. So I'm just going to very quickly do the same thing, but in Viveza. So we've got our here's one I prepared earlier, as it were. This is a basic raw conversion, but we've got it so that the fly is still quite dull and the greens are still a little bit vibrant. They're still a little bit in your face. Now, personally, I would recommend running any plugin, whether it's NIC or Topaz or whatever. I would recommend doing that via Photoshop because it allows you to layer them. It allows you to create a layer. With a layer, you can have a layer mask, you can reduce the opacity, you can essentially control, and you can apply more than one. If you only have if you use it from Lightroom into NIC and then back to Lightroom, it's a one shot. You don't get a chance to do it again. All right, and I would normally do this kind of thing with smart objects. I'm not going to do it today with smart objects. It's just a bit of complexity too far. I just want to show you how, if you've not met the NIC filters before, they are so much easier when it comes to making selections. Same basic principle. We are deciding which area we want to apply a change to, and then we're deciding what to do to that area. All right, but rather than having masks and brushes in the NIC filters, what you have are things called control points. And the control point essentially says, I want to place it, you place a control point somewhere, and you then have a circle that radiates out from that control point. Okay, now nothing has changed yet. What we're telling, excuse me 2 seconds, it's a delivery which I'm going to completely ignore. I do apologize. Okay, what NIC is going to do is it's going to make a selection based on the color, tonality, texture of where I've put the point, and it's going to think of the circle as being a kind of area of influence. It's going to spread out within that circle, looking for similar pixels to the one I've selected within that area. So I can now maybe just increase the brightness of that area. Maybe increase the contrast a little bit, something like that. Increase the structure. Structure is what NIC calls clarity, very similar kind of thing. All right, so I'm just going to pull that down. If you want to apply something else, like let's say we wanted to bring some more detail out of those wings, we can put a control point on that wing, and maybe just increase its brightness ever so slightly, but increase its structure, which is just going to bring out extra detail, a little bit of extra contrast. If you've applied an effect to one wing and you want to copy that effect onto the other one, you can alt-click, drag the control point over. That will make a duplicate control point. We can add another one maybe onto the head. Maybe add a little bit more brightness to that one, maybe bring in a little bit of contrast, a little bit of structure, something like that. All right, so this is point and shoot. You really can just go, I want this bit to be a bit brighter, this bit to be a bit darker, this bit to be a bit more contrast, less contrast, and so on. So there's none of this kind of going in and painting and all that kind of stuff. All you do is you plonk a point down and say, I want you to do something to this. All right, and we can do the same thing. Now we can start tackling the background. I can put a control point maybe on this very pale piece of leaf and say, I just want you to take the brightness and the contrast down of that leaf, not that leaf, that petal, I mean. Right, so we can do that. And now we can tackle the greens. So I'm going to plonk a control point down in those greens. This time I'm going to make the control point much bigger. And same thing applies. Maybe pull the contrast down, maybe pull the brightness down, something like that. Maybe pull the saturation down. All the things that we were doing in Lightroom, but we don't need to make that selection. It's just done it for us. And now I can just duplicate that control point around to the other bits of green, and I can apply it to maybe to that bit as well. Just holding the Alt key down, dragging the control point around, making duplicates. Okay, so this is now essentially point and shoot. All right, point, and if I wanted to change the color or wanted to change the tonality of the flower in the middle, I could do that. I could just increase that one, maybe bring the brightness down, or maybe make it slightly darker color, or maybe make it a slightly brighter color. You know, there are things that you can play around with.
Ian, I'm sorry to your timekeepers coming in.
Thank you. Yes. Well, as always, I'm going to overrun, for which I apologise. So
yeah, it would be nice to get to make sure we do sharpening and
yes.
topaz.
Okay. All right. Yeah, thank you, timekeeper.
Not
Thank you, timekeeper. All right. So that's just the same thing done in two different ways. Okay. So I was going to. Just one comment here, if you are going to take things into Photoshop or into external things, please make sure you take them in 16-bit. We're going to be playing around with the tonality here, and pushing and pulling the tonality and the color with an 8-bit image is going to give you posterization. All right. This is one where you can make selections without making selections. So this is a classic problem that you tend to have. Again, similar to what we did before, which is that this is some wild geranium that I saw growing around. So I'm just going to crop into the area that I'm interested in, maybe that area like that one. Let's just make that a little bit bigger. Let's get the exposure right. Not exposure, the color balance. Something like it was quite blue there. The auto white balance on the camera has been fooled by all the green there, so I'm just going to bring that down to something like that, and we can then play around with the exposure, play around with the blacks, something a bit like that. Maybe give it a bit more contrast. Now the problem we've got is we can get it right. This is a classic problem when you're playing around. It happened with the previous picture. You can get it right for the flowers, but it always seems to be the greens that go a little bit haywire. The greens can go a little bit in your face. They can go emerald, they can go too saturated or whatever. Now, one way of doing work on colors selectively without mucking around with selections is just to use HSL, the hue, saturation, luminance. And that's probably the right way of doing it here. So because we've got a separation by color, I can go in there and we can shift the hue. The easiest way of doing this, you can use the sliders, but the easiest way is just to use this thing, that what Adobe call the targeted adjustment tool. So in the areas where the greens are a little bit too emerald, you can push them towards the yellow. So I'm just going to click on that green. That's pushing it towards the yellow. If I push that, that's clearly going way too emerald. I'm going to push it towards the yellow. Saturation, again, I can click somewhere and just pull the saturation down a little bit, and luminance, again, click on those greens, pull them down, and we have toned down the background, those greens, so they're looking much more natural, and we haven't had to make any selections. The selections have been implicit because we have worked on the color. Right, and there are some pictures you can do that with. You don't actually need to make selections for. So this is another one. I'm not going to work through this, but this is an image of some knapweed, I believe. But we've ended up with colours. We can just push and pull the colours and end up with something which is maybe a bit like that. All we've done is just pull the colors, we've changed the hue, we've changed the hue of the background slightly, we've changed the saturation slightly, we've changed the lightness slightly, we've played around with the colors of the buds of the knapweed, and we've also, if I put that side by side, if I compare those two side by side, all I've done is lighten up this area in the middle. We've lightened up the purple of the flowers. We've altered the hue slightly, and you've ended up doing an edit without doing any edits, effectively, all done by playing around with color. So don't discount the fact you can use HSL for doing this kind of edit. Okay, let's move on to I'm going to go way over. Anna's going to be so cross with me, but never mind. I'll have to survive. Okay, I'm not going to talk too much. Oh, stupid Lightroom is in. Why is it in? Oh, it's because I'm in compare mode. There we are. All right. Sharpening. I've already mentioned that the eye tends to go to areas which are sharp and ignore areas that aren't sharp. The biggest single mistake that most people make when they're editing their pictures is to sharpen globally. And I just want to illustrate here, there are so many different ways of doing the sharpening, but this is an image that requires basically 2 adjustments, and I'll show you roughly what they are, but let's just go into a develop. And you'll often find this, that you end up with a subject which is sharp or relatively sharp and a background which is relatively blurred. And the thing about noise is that A, it is emphasized if you apply sharpening to it, and B, it is most noticeable in smooth areas. So this is one where I've applied a little bit I've done a basic raw conversion, okay? And we've got two problems here. The first is, come on, 100%. There we are. We've got a little bit of an area here of burnout on the back of the bird. But if we were to, I've turned sharpening off here, but let me show you what happens if I turn sharpening on. I apply the sharpening globally. It sharpens up the bird nicely. Now, I don't know if this is coming. I will go over the top because I'm on Zoom, just so that it becomes obvious. Clearly, the bird is now appearing really nice and sharp, but I don't know if you can see this horrible kind of wormy artifacts appearing in the background. All right, and that's we see this all the time. We're also starting to see halos appearing around the bird, things like that. So the bottom line is, when you're applying sharpening, you only need to sharpen those bits that you need to sharpen. Most of the area you don't actually need to sharpen. All right, so very quickly, I'll do this in Lightroom. You can do a very similar kind of thing in other applications too. I'll do it in Lightroom. To attack that back, the area with the burned highlights, I'm going to use a brush with a very, very low flow. Okay, and I'm just going to pull the highlights down. So I'm going to go in here and just paint with a very, very low flow. But I'm going to turn up, I'll leave auto masking on because I want to be very careful. Right, if I turn the mask on, show the overlay, you can see what I'm painting. It's very, very, very dilute. But you don't need to do very much. So I'm just painting where I want this effect to be applied. And hopefully that will have gone. It's still showing the overlay. There we are. Okay, so hopefully you'll be able to see that it's pulling back some of that highlight detail. I didn't want to do a global highlight recovery because that would have just darkened down the entire bird, which we don't want. Okay, So that's one selective adjustment. And then of course we can make another one. I'm going to do a select subjects. I'll do this entirely in Lightroom. As I say, there are lots of different ways of doing this, but I will do this in Lightroom. This will actually make a pretty good job, I think, of selecting the bird. So we can apply we can now apply selective sharpening to the bird. If you're going to do if you're going to judge sharpening, judge it at 100%. Okay, so I'm going to push extra sharpening. I'm going to maybe apply a little bit of extra clarity to the bird as well, to make the bird stand out. Okay, and then we want to do the opposite to the background. So classic thing, click that 3 dots, duplicate and invert mask. Now we're dealing with the background, and what we can do is we can pull the sharpness away from the background and maybe apply a little bit of noise reduction to the background. So we've now got a bird which stands out because of its sharpness against the background. And I can also, if I wanted to, I'm just going to zoom that out, I could actually just darken the background a little bit if I wanted to make the bird stand out even more. All right, so these are just applying sharpening and other things selectively, only apply them where they need to. So I only applied the highlight recovery where it needed to be, and I only applied the sharpening where it needed to be. And in this case, I'm going to go back here and just lift those shadows up a little bit. Shadows of the bird. Okay, you get the idea. The important thing is you're applying only what's necessary to the area where it needs to be applied, all right, and not applying it elsewhere. Okay, this is a slightly different one. I'm going to use this as an image that you've probably seen before, one of mine. So that's what the original image looked like, if I can get that. So it was a relatively tight crop to bring it in. It was one of those pictures, you know, you don't often see bittern flying, and I was lucky to get that one, but it wasn't as sharp as it could have been. All right, now this has had the sharpening turned off, but I just wanted to show you the sharpness was basically nailed, but the 1,000th wasn't quite enough to freeze motion. It was on a 300mm with a 2x converter, which wasn't the sharpest combination anyway, so it's not perfectly sharp. Now this is the kind of image that something like Topaz Sharpener really excels in. But you can apply the sharpening selectively. All right, so I'll take it into here. I just want to show you the kind of job it does. I'm not going to, as I say, if you're interested in the sharpening noise reduction talk, there is a separate one already recorded. But bringing it into Photoshop, I've created a new layer because I want to apply the sharpening to that layer, and go filter, sharpen. No, I want to go filter, Topaz Labs, sharpen. And obviously it's one of those things you've got to, Topaz gives you lots and lots of different models to work with. I'm interested primarily in the head of the bird. Right, so I'm just going to move that around here. And because I've done this before, I happen to know that the motion blur with these settings actually does an incredible job. Absolutely incredible job of actually pulling that sharpness back. Okay, now if you do use Topaz, you actually have masking within Topaz, which is sometimes, I'm going to use it here because I don't want sharpening applied to other parts of this picture. So open that up, and that will turn masking on. Now, the default is to auto find a subject. And in this case, guess what? It's found the bird. All right. Now, you can go in there and you can paint subjects, and you can go and erase, very much the same kind of way. You go into this thing called refine, which allows you to add and to subtract. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to go back and go back. I want to go auto subjects. Undo changes because I don't want to do that. There we are. I'm just going to accept that. So this is now a mask that's being applied by Topaz, not by Photoshop, and then go apply. So again, this is another of those images where you really would not have wanted to apply sharpening globally, because it's very smooth behind. You don't want to exacerbate the noise in the background of this image, but you do want to apply very specific sharpening to the bird. Now, its Topaz is actually quite heavy on CPU. I don't know if my video is going to continue. There we are. It's come through. All right. So if I now zoom in to 100%, you should find that what we've got there is that lovely and sharp up here. All right. I'm going to show you one more trick in here while we're in. And if you've got something like this and you still want to add a tiny little bit more sharpness, there is a tool within Photoshop to do it, which is sometimes really useful. And for that, you create yourself a blank layer. I'm going to call it extra sharpening. And it's down here. It's called the sharpen tool. It's normally hidden under the blur tool. And the trick with the sharpen tool is to make sure you use it at very low strength, with sample all layers enabled and protect detail enabled. So 10% seems to be about right. Again, we're doing sharpening, so always judge this at 100%. Okay, and I can just go in and paint over the area that I want a little bit more sharpening applied. So it's normally just a tiny little bit more around things like beaks, claws, eyes. All right, so I'm just going to go into the other end of and just paint over a little bit of extra sharpening over those claws. All right, and if I show you what's on that layer, it is virtually nothing. That's what's on that sharpening layer, virtually nothing. And yet, when you actually look at it, it just makes those little bits pop out. All right, so that's using a third-party package to do the essentially the motion blur removal on the bird, and then using Photoshop to do a little bit of selective sharpening on the critical bits of the bird. And of course, nothing has been sharpened here. Key thing to remember, I'm just going to shut that down because we don't need that anymore. Key thing to remember here is that when you move from Lightroom into Photoshop, for heaven's sake, remember to turn sharpening off in the raw converter. So if I go back to this is one that I prepared earlier, but the sharpening had been turned off. Right? If you have sharpening turned on, then the image that's taken into Photoshop will have had sharpening applied. It's much more difficult then to do extra selective sharpening and remove the noise that will have been added. Okay, so I'm clearly not going to be able to cover absolutely everything. I was going to show you, this is another thing where you can, again, you've got a whole choice of different ways of doing the sharpening and noise reduction in together. So this is the raw image as came out of camera. So obviously it's looking dull. We can crop it. That turns into something like that. I can bring that up. Whoops, 100%. But we want to apply sharpening in very specific places, like we want to be able to sharpen the spider, and we want to be able to sharpen the knapweed bud on which the spider is sitting. But because we've got noise in the background, I don't know how that's coming across in Zoom. This was shot at ISO 1250. There is some background noise coming in, so we want to be able to apply noise reduction to the background and sharpening to the spider. And there are loads of different ways of doing that. I will go through one here. You can use one of the Topaz plugins that will do a really good job here. It will find the spider and the flower bud. If necessary, you can go in and you can do some adjustments. You can actually use the NIC noise reduction, define, and sharpener to be able to do that. But the trick here, you can do straight from Lightroom if you want to, providing you're prepared to take the image into Photoshop. And I've got a couple here which I've prepared. So basically here, these two images here, if I bring those up side by side, what you should find out, what you should see hopefully, is that the image, they are identical apart from two settings. The one on the left has sharpening but no noise reduction. So we've got a sharp spider, but we've also exacerbated the noise in the background. And the one on the right has applied noise reduction. So we've got a nice smooth background, but we've lost all the detail in the spider. All right, so one of the techniques you can use here, if you don't want to use one of the plugins, is simply to take those two and then blend them together. All right, and this is, I'll take you into one that I've created earlier to save you having to sit through me doing this one. Spider, where a topaz denoise. Okay, Lightroom noise and sharpen. I'll just reopen that image here. So essentially what you do is you take the two images and you open them as two layers. All right, and that's what we've got here. If you can look here, we've got two layers here. If I zoom right into 100%, and I look at the bottom layer is the noise reduction layer. Okay, and the layer above, I'm just going to turn the layer mask off at the moment. The layer above is the layer that's been sharpened. Okay, and the trick now is to apply a layer mask to that to blend the two together. So this was, I'll turn the layer mask back on again. If I show you what the layer mask looks like, that's what the layer mask looks like. And it was just painted. I just painted the layer mask very, very quickly. So I painted over the layer mask where I wanted. I will do that very quickly now, just to show you it's not a trick. So I just want to delete the layer mask. I'm going to apply a black layer mask, go in there with a paintbrush, exactly the same as doing it in Lightroom, only this time you've got to be explicit about what color we're painting in. We want to paint in white paint. All right, so I'm going to go with that one, and I want let's choose 50% opacity, and we can then go in and just paint over the area where I want the sharpening to be applied. I don't know if that's coming across, but I can then just paint over the legs of the spider and so on. All right, hopefully that's, yeah, you're seeing that that is now coming out and the spider is now standing out as being sharp against the background. And we can actually do exactly the same thing here with the bud. We can just go over and paint areas where we want the sharpening to be applied and leave the areas where it's not. So here we've got a sharpen layer and a noise reduce layer. So where we're painting white, we are seeing the sharpen, and where we've got black, we're seeing the noise reduction. All right, and this is, so that's why you're able to get, and that spider now stands out much more strongly against the background because it's sharp and the background is smooth. As I say, you could do that with Nick, you can do that with Topaz. I'm just doing it with Lightroom. Same basic principle. Start off, you end up with a noise reduction and sharpening. Have a look at the other video if you're more interested in that. Okay. You're about to smack me again, aren't you, Anne?
I have got a question or two from about Topaz. Could I ask those now?
Yeah, please do.
It's from Godfrey. He said, in Topaz, why does it have two motion blur quadrants? Are they just doing exactly the same thing?
No, that was probably because I'd set how I'd set the quadrants up actually. If I it doesn't really matter if I go into any of these files, doesn't matter which one. Where are we? And if I go filter, Topaz Labs, Topaz Sharpen. This is true with any of the, is true with denoise and with sharpen. You can change what the quadrants are. The reason I've got motion blur normal and motion blur normal is because that's how idiot me happened to have it set up. So I could change this one over here to be standard. All right, so I've got the quadrant mode up here. So now, because I've selected that quadrant, I can change that to standard. I could change this quadrant to be out of focus, very noisy. So you can choose what's in each quadrant.
Okay, and there was one other one from Godfrey. In a previous talk, you advised using Topaz Sharpen and then using Topaz Denoise as a separate operation. This gave a better result. With the newer Topaz versions of Topaz, is this still your advice?
It's an interesting one. I don't know about other people. I if the image is noisy, I tend to use denoise and the sharpening within denoise. I find that tends to work better. If my image is already relatively free of noise or has a problem to do with focus, to do with motion blur or whatever, at that point I will use sharpen. It has got better, and on the whole I try and do only one if I can. So I will, yes, to be honest, the one I use more than anything else is denoise. I use denoise more than anything else. So for an image like this, I would have used denoise. The bittern's a special case, because the bittern was actually not sharp for a different reason. It doesn't, yeah, you can apply Lightroom sharpening to that and it will not look sharp because there was a tiny bit of motion blur and it just wasn't quite sharp enough. This is where sharpen really excels. I think this is the kind of image where I would be lost without Topaz Sharpen. Having said that, 90% of the time I would use denoise and the sharpening within denoise rather than sharpen. Which may sound a bit strange. So the answer to your question is I don't often do a denoise and a sharpness, two separate operations. I will tend to do either one or the other. If it's a noisy image, I will almost always use denoise with the sharpening within denoise. If it's not noisy, I will tend to use sharpen. Or there's a special case like this where it's got a bit of motion blur. I hope that answers the question. Okay, I'm just going to show you again. I'll just show you. This is a classic problem you get where you can't actually use any of the color selectors very easily because the colors are just too similar. And the same thing happens when it comes to finding edges. And so what you end up doing, this is the effect that I wanted to end up with. So if I just take you into here and just show you what the masks were. I did a basic select subject. All right, so that's mask one. Whoops. All right, and you can see I've even named them. But if I just hold over the subject, you can see that it's missed bits out. Bits of horns are missing, bits of legs are missing, and also there are bits that have been selected that shouldn't be selected, like the area between the horns and the area between the horns and the ears and things like that. So this is one of those, what you could go in and paint here if you wanted to, but you're probably better off starting with a select subject and then just doing a little bit of adjustment. So what I did then was to remove the bit of the background. If you hover your cursor over each of these masks, it will show you there. So those were where I removed the bits that shouldn't have been there. And then I applied them, what I've called the missing bits. So those are where I put back into the selection the area that just wasn't put there by select subject. So if you look at the combination of those three masks, you end up with that, which is basically a rough selection of the two Impala, which are fighting like Billy-O. So you can then go in and do your again, very similar to what I've done before. If you look on the right hand side, we've made them a little bit brighter. We've pulled the highlights back. We've increased the shadows a little bit. We've increased the clarity and we've increased the sharpness. All right, so that's what we've done to the subject. And then we've applied a background. Now the background is essentially the inverted mask, but same thing as I've done before, with the foreground removed using a linear gradient. And what that's done is to pull the exposure down, reduce the contrast a bit, reduce the highlights, pull dehaze down, which has lightened the background and removed some of that detail, reduced sharpness, and applied a little bit of noise reduction. So what that's done is it's really, I don't know if I must be able to turn that particular mask on and off. So that's the effect of the background. Okay, that's the effect of the subject. And then I've also applied a vignette. So that is the vignette, just by darkening the outsides. So what we've ended up with, again, if I put those two side by side and compare them, you should be able to see that one of them, hopefully, the one on the left, the subject should stand out far more from the background than the one on the right. It's because we've toned down, we've removed the, again, because it's lower contrast, lower saturation, that's what the idea will go to the bits that are sharp and are bright and keep away from those areas which are dull, low in contrast, low whatever. Okay, so we'll go back and, all right, we have hit the witching hour.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to go through that one. This is one where I was going to show you different things of how basically just work through an example entirely in Nick. You'll just have to take my word for it that you can start off with something like that on the left hand side and end up with something like that on the right hand side, just using very, very basic adjustments. Just to give you an idea, all that's happened here is I have obviously corrected the white balance. I have picked up some of the dark shadows, brought some of the dark shadows to life. I've applied selective sharpening only to the areas where I want the eye to look, which is around the icebergs, not on the background. And I've done a little bit of lightening and darkening and then applied a vignette. That's all it is to turn that on the left to that on the right. Okay, and the final thing, which I don't have time for, sadly, was a rematch between Nick and Lightroom, basically using Nick tools and Lightroom tools basically to do exactly the same thing. So if I start off with, that was the original image, the one that's on the left, to end up with something like that just by doing some selective adjustments. So, as always, as Anne will tell you, I have overrun because that's what I do. So I apologise for that. Were there any other questions that came up?
Well, I thought actually, Ian, what I might do is to just give a big vote of thanks to you, and then those who have got their supper sort of in the oven and it's burning or something can shoot off. But if other people would like to ask questions, and there are one or two in the chat still, quite a lot of people hopping off and saying how wonderful the talk had been, and I'm sure that's true, then they can stay on and have a chat and things. So I'm sure everyone will join me in saying that that was, as somebody's just said, truly inspirational with lots and lots of tips. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. I'm sorry I was too slow at the beginning and too fast at the end.
No problem at all. You always want to put in everything.
The thing is, at the beginning, it's more important that you understand the basics, and then it just kind of speeds up as you go along.
Somebody, so I will just say those who have to go, we will excuse you. But otherwise, John said you might like to try the adaptive Lightroom presets, but I know that's a forbidden word preset to Ian as an engineer.
No, I don't. Right, okay. There is the old saying that real engineers don't use presets except their own. But there's nothing wrong with a preset. Particularly if you've got your own, you can use the presets. There are people who bring in styles and presets. Whatever works for you. This is one of the things that I wanted to try and bring across here, is that there are lots and lots of different ways of doing this. Everything I've done in Lightroom, I could have done in Photoshop. It would have been a lot more complex. One of the things that Photoshop does make actually much more difficult than both Lightroom and Nick is doing multiple adjustments to the same area. It makes it really quite tricky to do that. With Photoshop, it's usually one area, one adjustment. I love the fact you can do multiple adjustments to the same area in both Nick and Lightroom. So lots of different ways of doing this. If it works for you, great. All right. The important thing to get in your mind is you don't have to do everything everywhere. All right.
Carry on, Ian. Sorry.
No, that's basically all I was saying.
Somebody asked, and that's on the same theme, which is why I interrupted. Would luminosity masks work the same?
They can. Be very, very careful with luminosity masks. You could, like this is a case where you might think that luminosity masks would help you, because you might want to, for example, only target the bright areas in the picture. So you could make a selection of now you've got to make a selection first of all. So we'll try making a something like that. I've forgotten where the luminosity mask comes in now. Oh, they've changed it. I've forgotten. Please, someone help me. Remind me where luminosity masks come in with this one. It's luminosity. It's a separate selection now, isn't it? They've changed where this is, and I don't use light.
No, I think we better have one. Oh, there.
Luminance range. That's right. So you could, for example, apply a luminance range, and you can split. I think you've got to hold the Alt key down, haven't you?
Yeah, I was going to say I have done it.
Very, very fiddly.
Yeah.
So you can, for example, do something. And if the answer, I find it really tricky because the luminance mask is probably better than, I don't know, the chrominance one. If you want to apply something to a color, I personally think luminosity masks in Photoshop are much, much better. The answer is you could do it. You could now try pulling the exposure down. You have to be very careful because you end up with effects like that if you're not careful with luminosity masking. So I would be very, very careful. You end up with, I've never really got them to work well in the raw converter. Maybe it's just my perseverance or lack of perseverance. I've never really liked them, but if it works for you, try it. It's a bit like the color selection. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, try a different method.
Okay, well, I think you probably want to go off and get your tea started. So
I can hear the happy sound of my dogs being fed in the background, which you could probably hear as well. Actually,
so I think we will let you go now. And just again say thank you. You've still got quite a lot of people online. If anyone wants to unmute themselves and
if anybody's got, I'll happily
stop the share. If you like.
Well, I can do, or if anybody wants to, if there's any questions they want to ask, then please feel free to unmute yourself.
Yeah, unmute yourself rather than put it in the chat, because the chat is absolutely full of people saying thank you, thank you, thank you, very helpful, thank you. I'm exhausted, somebody said. I'm sure if they are, you are.
So am I. Yeah, it's all right.